Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Hurd in the House podcast. It is my pleasure today to welcome Congressman Richard Hudson from North Carolina's 9th Congressional District. This is the central part of North Carolina. I think, Mr. Chairman, it's just southeast of Greensboro. Is that right?
Well, I start in downtown Greensboro and run all the way to downtown Fayetteville, and I live in the middle in Pinehurst.
And I called him Mr. Chairman because he's also the chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee. He's a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, which is one of the oldest committees, one of the most important committees with broadest jurisdiction in the House of Representatives. And last, but certainly not least, actually most importantly, he is husband to Renee and father to, how old is your boy?
Lane is 9 years old. He'll be 10 in September.
That is a great age. So welcome, Mr. Chairman. It's great to have you on Hurd in the House.
Great to be with you.
You're actually the number 3 podcast guest that we have, so you're sort of at the top of the lineup. So, we have the heavy hitters in this here, so you're right in the sweet spot.
Wow. I hope I don't screw it up. I might be the last.
All right, so you grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. What's the best North Carolina barbecue joint that not enough people know about?
Wow. So this is, you're getting right into the heart of the matter here. I'd much rather discuss religion or politics because barbecue is very contentious in North Carolina. I actually moved to Charlotte as a teenager when I was 14 years old. I lived in eastern North Carolina for the first part of my life, and barbecue is a very regional thing in North Carolina. In eastern North Carolina, we have a vinegar-based pepper sauce that I think is superior because it draws the flavor of the pork out. Okay. If you go to the western part of our state, they cover it with this tomato-based sauce that I think covers up the flavor of the meat. And then we have the Lexington style, which is in kind of the central part of the state, which is sort of a mix of both. It's a pepper vinegary, but it's a little more tomatoey. And so it's, people really based on where you grow up, people are very passionate about which is better. I will tell you one of the hardest, test of whether I was going to be a real leader or whether I was going to pander to my constituents was my first campaign. I was not in Congress yet. I went to the Mallard Creek Barbecue, big political event in Charlotte, and again, I'm campaigning to represent Lexington, North Carolina, and the reporter sticks a camera in my face and asks, which is the best barbecue?
Ooh, that is a fraught, especially as somebody that hasn't been elected yet.
That's right. And so, a typical politician would have pandered and said, well, the Lexington style is better because I was trying to earn those votes. But I'm a leader. And I looked in the camera and I said, I grew up in eastern North Carolina, so I prefer the eastern style, but that Lexington style is pretty good too.
Nice. Did you? And, what was the response?
I think people respected that I was telling the truth, and they elected me. So I've continued to do that, to tell the truth and do what I think's right.
There is a great lesson to be learned. So all of you out there that are maybe thinking about entering public service someday, that's a small but important lesson to make. And people notice that authenticity as well. So
you can't fake it, and I stress to my staff, that's the most important thing is, if they're writing something for me, make it authentic. Use words I use. Don't try to be something I'm not. My grandfather, biggest influence in my life, was a great man, but he told me if you always tell the truth, you'll never have to remember what you told somebody. And the older I've gotten, the wiser that advice is.
That's very true. Now, before you became a member of Congress, you were a staffer here in Washington, D.C. Who did you work for? What did you do?
So I started out as a district director for a gentleman named Robin Hayes, who represented the seat I now represent. He was my home congressman and did that for a number of years. And then I came to Washington and was the chief of staff to a freshman named Virginia Fox.
Ooh, I've heard that name.
Yeah, she's now the chairman of our Rules Committee. And then I also was the chief of staff to 2 members from Texas. John Carter is still in Congress with us.
That's right.
Good man. The only thing we ever disagreed on was Texas versus North Carolina barbecue. But I had some great experience. And I'll tell you, back then I said I'm never run for office. I like being the behind-the-scenes person that helps that person who's serving. But I felt it tugging at my heart that God had more purpose for me. And while he was working on me internally, our district changed through redistricting, and it became an opportunity. My former boss lost in 2008 to a Democrat, and in 2012 I was asked to run, and took me a while. It took me a while to figure out whether that was the right thing to do or not. But really, one of the things that drove me was I'd seen people do this job well, and I'd seen people do it not well. And I felt like I wouldn't need on-the-job training, and that maybe I could put some of those lessons learned to use for my constituents.
You could hit the ground running for sure. So when you were a staffer and you first came in the district and then here in D.C., what did you think about Congress that later turned out to be false?
Well, I think what comes to mind is, we're so tribal. I mean, we've gotten to the point in this country where we're so polarized that, I wear a red jersey, you wear a blue jersey. That means we have to not get along, and I can't support your ideas. And it's really gotten polarized. But if you come to Washington and you get to know the members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, there are some outliers in both parties, people that maybe they aren't really good people and maybe they have different motivations. But the vast majority of members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, have come to serve their country for the right reasons. They're patriotic Americans. I just happen to believe Republican ideas are better than Democrat ideas to make the country better. But I don't question the motives of members. And I think that was a surprise once you're exposed to, in my case, to Democrat members of Congress. Again, I think their policy ideas are silly sometimes, but I don't question their motives.
I think that's a great insight. What member of Congress, past or present, do you most admire? Maybe that's not a fair question, but there you go.
Yeah. Well, I think Robin Hayes, my predecessor, comes to mind. He was a real mentor to me. He was a man of faith, a man of character. He really prioritized his family. And these jobs are demanding. There's a lot of time away, a lot of time on the road. But I saw how he prioritized his marriage, how he prioritized time with his family, and that really struck with me. And that's something I've tried to model. My title as dad is way more important than my title as congressman.
Amen. Tell me about your favorite movie, favorite book.
Well, that's tough. So I love to read. I love movies. I'm kind of an adventure. So Braveheart comes to mind. It's a great movie. It's a story of a little boy who lost his father, but his uncle stepped in to teach him how to be a man and teach him how to not just fight, but how to think. And what a great epic story of, it's got everything. It's got a love story. It's got great battle scenes. It's got a fight for freedom against tyranny. Anyway, that's what comes to mind on.
That's a good one. So you have so many responsibilities. You're a legislator. You're also a leader with the National Republican Congressional Committee. How do you balance all of those responsibilities with the needs of your district? How do you make sure that you're taking care of the folks back home and delivering what you need to deliver for North Carolina's 9th?
Well, that's a good question, because I think that is the key to whether you're successful or not. Is how do you balance that? And for me, it's a matter of prioritization, and it's not only me having the right priorities, but me articulating those to my staff so that my staff is spending their time on priorities and they are budgeting my time, because our staffs have a big say in how we spend our time during the day. And I have tried to be very clear to all of my staff that our number one responsibility is to the people that elected us, to take care of the people in our district, to respond to their questions and their needs. And everything else we get to do is because they gave us that trust. And so I constantly try to remind my team, returning that phone call to that constituent is much more important than whatever amendment or other thing you're working on. And so that's number one priority. And then, the rest of the things you kind of fall into place. And budgeting your time is probably the biggest challenge we face. But if you've got a prioritization, and if your entire organization understands your values and understands the priorities, you can make it work.
One of the other things that you are a leader on in Congress is the Second Amendment and protecting the individual right that's protected by that critical part of our Bill of Rights. Can you tell me, Mr. Chairman, if you were to sit down with a skeptical college student who doesn't own a gun and is wary of the Second Amendment, what's the first argument you'd make?
Well, this is an important issue to me. It was an important issue before I came to Congress. In fact, some of my earliest memories, going back to that grandfather who was a big influence on me, he poured his time into me. He taught me to hunt and fish. We spent a lot of time in the outdoors together. But he, every month, got the NRA magazine. And I used to love flipping through that magazine. And I can remember reading articles about the Second Amendment and how it's our first right, because the Second Amendment allows us to defend all our other rights. If anyone ever threatens it, internally or externally, the fact that we have the ability to arm ourselves and defend ourselves means that we can protect those rights. And so I've always fundamentally knew that this was more than just being able to hunt, which is important to have access to hunting and fishing, but it's much more fundamental than that. It's if we are ever attacked, in fact, famously the leader, the general in Japan during World War II was asked, why didn't you invade the mainland of the United States? He said, because everybody has a gun. Basically we would get stopped. And I think that's important. But also, if the government ever becomes so tyrannical and that they start taking away our rights, and this is something that I think a lot of people had trouble wrapping their brain around until COVID. You look at COVID where, some state governments were shutting down churches and saying you can't congregate in church, where they were, saying you have to stay inside and wear a mask and all these things. I think it's a little bit easier to imagine how you could go down that slippery slope and get to a point where you've got a government that is threatening your basic rights and as an American, and your ability to be able to defend yourself is very important. So I think I would start with the constitutionality of it. I think I would also want to take that person to a shooting range and let them experience a firearm, because I think a lot of people that didn't grow up around firearms are very afraid of firearms. And look, they are very dangerous. They're a tool that can be very dangerous, but it's something I think people ought to understand how they work. And understand that that bullet's not going to come out of that barrel until you pull the trigger. I've found it's a great way for me to relieve stress and have fun is to go to a shooting range. And I think you'd start with the Constitution. Secondly, I think you'd get them a little experience around a firearm. And then finally, I think I think an important point is if the places that have the strictest gun laws in our country tend to be the places that have the most crime. Law-abiding citizens are not the folks we're worried about. We're worried about criminals using firearms, and criminals are not going to follow any law. So you can pass every law in the books, and criminals are still going to do bad things. And so I think a lot of people have good intentions when they want to have gun control laws, but I think if you understand the way it plays out, all gun control laws do is create more victims who aren't capable of defending themselves.
I think those are three really great points, and the Second Amendment is one of the top issues for my district, Mr. Chairman. The Southern Western Colorado, we prize our Second Amendment rights, so that's something I hear loud and clear from the people I represent as well. And that's why I know you got a number of bills that you've carried in your time here in Congress protecting that Second Amendment right.
I should say I really appreciate your stand on Second Amendment. You have been you very quickly established yourself as a leader on this issue and someone who's in the fight to make sure you preserve our rights. And I appreciate having you fight shoulder to shoulder with me on this. It matters. And so thank you for your leadership. There's an federal excise tax on firearms and ammunition, but states are starting to issue excise taxes on firearms. And in some cases, they're not doing it to get revenue for the state. They're doing it to make it harder for people to access firearms, harder for legal citizens to access firearms. And so what we're doing is saying to states like California and others who are trying to subvert our rights through this tax scheme is that you can't do it, and preventing them from, there's been some proposals even here in Congress to have like a 1,000% tax. Can you imagine? The thing is, anything you do to make a firearm more expensive, all that means is that working people are more likely to be vulnerable, and it'll make it harder for them to defend themselves and their families. Again, the criminals are going to have the guns, and rich people will be able to afford the tax, but working people, they're the ones that you're preventing from having access to the ability to defend their families, to feed their families in some cases. So I think it's a really important issue.
Tell me, what do critics often misunderstand about gun ownership in rural communities?
Well, again, I think it starts with just an ignorance of firearms in general. I think it's people that don't grow up around firearms. They're very afraid of the firearms. I see it when we have debates here in the Congress. Folks on the other side of the aisle, the things they say don't make sense, and they come from an emotional place. And so, people that grew up around firearms, I grew up around firearms. We had them in our home. And I knew that I didn't touch those unless I was with an adult who told me it was okay. In many ways, that made me safer as a child than a kid who might have grown up in a home completely ignorant of firearms. So if I were visiting a friend and there were a pistol laying on a table as a young boy, I would know I don't touch that pistol unless an adult, allows me to. But a kid who didn't have exposure might pick up the pistol and be curious about it and fumble around with it, and that makes them more vulnerable. So I think, having a healthy understanding of firearms, having a very healthy respect for how dangerous they can be is an important thing to teach your children. I joke around that my son was the only kid in daycare running around with his finger off the trigger of his plastic gun. I taught him finger discipline, muzzle discipline.
That's amazing. That's great.
It's important, and so, but for folks in rural America, as I mentioned earlier, going out and shooting a gun at a range or somewhere safe is a lot of fun as a sport. For a lot of us, it's a way we put food on the table. For me, it's a luxury. For some people, it's how they feed their families in some rural areas. And also it's, again, having a firearm so that you can defend your family, whether it's from, tyranny, the Japanese invasion, or a criminal breaking in your home. I think it's important to a lot of us. And, I guess there's another group out there that just likes to collect guns, some people collect vases or garden gnomes. There's some of us who like to collect firearms because a lot of them are beautiful works of art. And
that's right.
And it's so there's a lot of reasons why those of us that live in rural areas like to own firearms, I think it's just one of the reasons why I love that way of life and that culture that we grew up in.
When I was campaigning for Congress, I was not really earning an income, and so my wife told me I wasn't allowed to buy any more guns while I was a candidate. But she didn't say that I couldn't enter raffles at like NRA events. And so
loophole.
That was my. I was helping out a good cause. So
Well, I hope you were more successful than me. I probably entered 1 million raffles in my life, and I rarely ever win anything.
I'm with you so far. So no luck there yet. There will be more opportunities in the future. Let's quickly shift gears. A little bit of a pun intended there to NASCAR. You are a NASCAR fan. Tell me a little bit about NASCAR, how you got into it, and how would you recommend new fans find their favorite drivers and teams?
Great question. I grew up a racing fan. I've always loved NASCAR. And the folks at NASCAR call me the mayor of NASCAR because I've been such a strong advocate for them since I got in Congress. But, I just love the sport. I think, and for most people, the best way to be exposed is to go to a race. Because when you smell that rubber off the tires and you hear those engines, you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. There's no in between. I loved it. But as I got to Congress and started looking at it as an industry from a policy-making standpoint, I realized what a tremendous economic impact motorsports has on our country. Just the aftermarket of folks who like to kind of soup up their cars and go race them on a local track. It's about like an $8 billion industry in this country.
Oh,
so
wow.
I'm not even talking about NASCAR or IndyCar or F1 or any of the big stuff. It's a massive economic impact in every state, except maybe Rhode Island. I think I read somewhere that Rhode Island doesn't have any racetracks, so we need to work on that. But every other state has racetracks, and they have people that participate in motorsports in one way or another. So it's a tremendous economic impact. It's also a big cultural importance to Americans. They certainly have racing in other parts of the world, but motor racing is a really American sport. It's something that Americans just seem to resonate with. But
except in Rhode Island. Rhode Island,
Yeah.
You need to get your act together.
Yeah, we got to work on Rhode Island.
What's the best place to watch a NASCAR race?
Well, Charlotte Motor Speedway, Concord, North Carolina is my favorite place. But there are tracks all over. And I'll say, going to a local short track and watching late models on Saturday night is a lot of fun, and it's a pretty inexpensive way to take your family out and entertain them. But also, I love watching on TV. And I would say, one way if you've never been to a race, you don't know anything about it, you could go on Netflix, and there's Drive to Survive, which is a Formula One kind of behind the scenes TV series that's been on for multiple seasons now. There's been 2 seasons of 100 Days to Indy, which is a great introduction to IndyCar. And I'll be honest, I didn't think much of open-wheel driving growing up. I was a NASCAR guy. I thought IndyCar was boring. But now that I've watched this show now for 2 seasons, and now I know the drivers and the owners, and I've gotten kind of appreciation for all the backstory and how tough it is compete in IndyCar. I now am a fan. And then NASCAR has had one season on Netflix with their show. But again, it's a great way to meet the drivers and get a feel for this is big business. It's not just, throw your car on a trailer and go to the track and run it. It's big business and a lot of money involved, and it's very entertaining for me just to kind of dive into it.
So Drive to Survive, 100 Days to Indy and NASCAR. We're going to put that in the show notes. If you encourage you guys to check that out, learn a little bit more about this awesome sport. Here's a little bit of a NASCAR philosophical question. What's the most important lesson that NASCAR offers on American culture that people in D.C. just don't get?
One thing that comes to mind is the stopwatch doesn't lie. The fastest car is going to win, and it doesn't matter where you came from, what your last name is. Doesn't matter what's on the side of your car. What matters is, can you get out there and compete and win? And I think that's a good life lesson. Is anybody in America can compete and win if you work hard enough. The other argument of that is there's big money involved in NASCAR, and if you don't have enough money to compete with the guys who have a lot of money, your car may not be as strong as the other cars. But it's also true that sometimes the best driver beats the best car. And so again, I would just say, if you can go out there and prove it, you can do it.
There's a big political metaphor in there. Having good drivers, it's not just the car. You got to have a good candidate also, right? You know that firsthand. How about hunting? So you're an avid hunter. You mentioned that a little bit before. What's the most memorable moment you've had while hunting?
I've had a lot of great memories over my life. My grandfather took me deer hunting for the first time when I was 4 years old, and I don't really remember it, but I got a photo of it, and it's a fading photo, but it's a beautiful photo of my grandfather towering over me, and I'm standing there holding a plastic rifle, and I've got that coat that all of us who grew up in the 80s had with the fur-lined collar, and we're off to my first deer hunt. But I do have memories of being on his back with my arms around his neck while he's wading through a flooded area of timber. I have some snapshot memories of being in a deer stand with him as a very young boy, and then over the years, lots of great memories with my grandfather. And what's really cool is I'm now getting to pass those on to my son. I've had some great memories of some beautiful animals I've been able to harvest, or some really fun hunts I've been on. But the most memorable by far was two seasons ago. My son got his first deer, and
where was that?
So we were in Alabama, visiting some friends down there. And, had a beautiful day. We're out in the woods together. We're stalking, and we came upon this deer. And I'm proud to say he dropped him on one shot right where he stood.
Wow.
And I've never been more proud, never been more excited about any harvest. And then being able to celebrate it with my son. And
that's a memory he will have for the rest of his life, for sure.
I think so.
Now, have you hunted in western or southern Colorado?
I have not.
Okay.
No one's ever invited me, and I'm really sad about that. I don't know if anybody listening on this podcast would take pity on me, but no, I'm just kidding.
We can, yes, there's plenty of folks I'm sure that would love to take you out on a great hunt in western or southern Colorado.
Not soliciting anything here, but I tell you what, you have a beautiful state, and your district is maybe I'm sure of it is the most beautiful part of the state. I've visited a bunch in the winter because I'm an avid skier. And I've been out in the summer enough to know how beautiful it is. And I actually married a girl from Evergreen, Colorado.
Oh, that's right. Renee's from Evergreen.
Yeah, and so we love visiting, but I've never done a hunt.
Okay, we're gonna have to fix that.
A lot of time in your state, so we'll.
That's on the to-do list. So, Mr. Chairman, all right, we're getting close to our time here. So I have a couple kind of rapid-fire questions. So, what is something about you that most people would not usually know or guess about you?
Well, I played rugby in college and played rugby for a few years after that. A lot of people probably wouldn't know about that. I loved the sport. I discovered it in college, that wasn't around when I was growing up in Charlotte. But, it's a great sport. It's probably the most challenging mentally I've ever played, but also very challenging physically.
Quite a spectrum. So rugby and NASCAR, that's
yeah. I'm kind of a Renaissance man, really, if you ask me.
I can see that. All right, next one. What's a change to house rules or house procedure that you think would make the biggest difference?
I think a balanced budget amendment. It's every state is required to balance their budget, and they're able to do it. And I think, of all the reforms you think about, that one I think would have the biggest impact. If we were forced find a way to balance it. It'll be very painful to do it that first time, because our spending is so out of control. I'm very hopeful that now that we've passed our budget resolution we're starting to write the reconciliation bill, that we're going to be able to get some real savings and really bend the cost curve so that future generations won't be in such a dire situation. The speaker talks about changing the trajectory on spending, turning the country around like turning a battleship. It's not like turning an IndyCar, which you can do on a dime. It's very hard to turn a battleship, but I think we're on the cusp of maybe a generational opportunity to bend that cost curve, get us back in the right direction. But I would love to see us really lock that in and require ourselves to balance that budget.
Amen. And we just had a big vote this morning in the House. Got some important legislation passed. Just really quickly for the folks back home, for me and for you, give us a quick take on how things are looking in this Congress 3 months in.
It's unbelievable to think that Donald Trump's only been president for 3 months. I mean,
yes.
I was back home. It was last week or the week before. We had a week of recess, and I had events all through my district. And I started every one by saying, "Can you believe he's only been president 2 months?" And everybody howls because it's just been amazing what he's been able to accomplish. And I think I'm proud of what the Congress has been able to accomplish. We passed the Lake and Riley Act. We've passed a lot of really good policy out of the House, but we've also really been driving this reconciliation process where we're gonna deliver Donald Trump's agenda. We're gonna unleash American energy, which I know is really important to your state, and
Amen.
And we're gonna get the president the resources he needs to secure that border. He's done a great job, but we really need to back him up and finish that job. And then we're gonna lock in the tax rates so that small businesses aren't harmed. And we're gonna make a serious dent in this spending and change the trajectory on the spending. I'm very proud of that. And our team, I love our team. We've someone described it as herding cats, and another one said no, it's more like exotic animals. It's not just herding cats. So and when you have a 1-seat majority like we did for most of this Congress so far, it's tough to get everybody to agree and go in the same direction, but I've just been so proud of our team. It's not always been pretty. It's not always been easy, but at the end of the day, we're all here dedicated to save America and to work with Donald Trump to get it done. And so far, so good. And let's keep up the momentum.
Well, it's an honor to be a part of that team, even as one of the rookies on the team. Last question. If you were not in Congress or politics at all, what would you be doing?
I'd be a NASCAR driver. Since we're on fantasy here, I doubt I would. I may not have the skills. A lot of us think we could do it, but if I get to pick, I would love to be a NASCAR driver.
My guest today has been Chairman Richard Hudson from North Carolina. Chairman Hudson, thank you so much for joining Hurd in the House.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.